Let me get the most important part of the way right now. In case you've lived under a rock for the past couple of years, Prey 2017 is not a sequel or reboot of the 2006 video game of the same name. It's entirely disconnected from the original Prey, but I'm required by law to make this statement like everybody else who has talked about this game. With that said, the reason why I wanted to play this game wasn't because of the name of the game itself, but because of the name of its developer, Arcane Studios. I've put off playing the Dishonored games for years, and after finally doing so recently and regretting not playing them sooner because of all the fun I've had with that series, I decided to tackle Prey shortly after completing those games. So let's address the second obvious disclaimer right here as well. Prey is not Dishonored. I know that it's fairly enticing to compare the two intellectual properties because both are made by the same developers and they're both supposed to be play-it-your-way immersive sims. So while I could make snide comments about how Prey's gameplay is nowhere near as sophisticated and polished as Dishonored's and feels decidedly more clunky, I'll try not to do that beyond this sentence. The third obvious disclaimer is that Prey is more of a spiritual successor to games like System Shock. But since I haven't played any of the Shock games pre-Bioshock, I can't comment on that front, because trying to get into old immersive sim PC games nowadays is often somewhat of a challenge, since gameplay and other creature comforts have evolved so much over the past 20 years that trying to delve into games like System Shock can be quite frustrating. Now that that's out of the way, let's start with the actual review of Prey on its own merits. Prey opens up with a fairly intriguing introductory sequence. The entire opening is laser focused on setting up a compelling mystery and giving the player ample reasons for exploring the space station they're stuck on for the duration of the game, the Talos 1. After a strong opening that manages to really pull the rug out from under you, it very soon becomes apparent that the narrative takes a very understated role for the rest of the game. In essence, Prey becomes a classic Metroidvania, where the game claims that you have the run of the entire space station from the word go. You can even venture outside and re-enter the station through a different airlock, presuming you've unlocked that one first from the inside, of course. There are obviously plenty of hazards and roadblocks that need to be overcome in order to truly explore the entirety of the station and piece together the story, though. You'll go back and forth between all of the parts of the Talos 1 multiple times in order to find ways of accessing other locked-off parts of the station. The way you do this is done through the classic multi-pronged method of giving players several ways of completing their tasks. Have you missed an opportunity of getting a keycard to a locked-off room you need to enter in order to retrieve an item or some information to continue? Maybe you can hack something nearby or find another creative way to enter that room. Pro tip, glass is breakable in this game. The game proudly touts the concept of playing it your own way in the tutorial message, and it certainly tries to offer a few ways of getting around every situation, such as creative level design, hacking, and alien powers to name a few, regardless of how you build your character. Speaking of building your character, even though Prey might look like a first-person shooter at a glance, it steers far more into role-playing game territory, with plenty of upgrade paths available for players to choose from. And they're not perfunctory upgrade paths like in most other modern kitchen sink type action adventures, which simply have character progression for the sake of having a token RPG progression system. Unlocking new abilities only happens when you level up their respective skill trees, and most base nodes on those trees offer some form of new gameplay to happen, not just a bland "you now do 2% more damage" upgrade. Those types of upgrades are relegated to the higher tiers of the skill trees and in swappable perks called chipsets. Though to be honest, I felt that those chipsets are mostly not interesting enough to spend a lot of time on. The way you get to unlock your permanent abilities is also solved far more elegantly than through traditional leveling systems. You can find items called neuromods all over the station, and if you have enough of them, you can unlock new abilities through what must be one of the most horrifying ways of upgrading yourself I've ever seen. You don't just earn experience points for doing stuff in the game, and once you cross a magical arbitrary threshold you get to pick an upgrade. No, instead the game reinforces the idea that you're supposed to be exploring this space station by giving you the incentive of finding more neuromods while you're doing that, so you can expand your suite of abilities. Neuromods can also be fabricated via the crafting system, but crafting them requires harvesting specific raw materials, some of which can only be found within enemies, which again ties into the exploration of finding and battling enemies. Not to mention that neuromods pull triple duty even beyond that by also being the narrative reason for the player character's amnesia, because prior to the game the neuromods your character had were all removed, and a side effect of that procedure is that your memory resets to the last moment before the neuromods were first installed. Becoming more powerful is tied directly to you as a player becoming more knowledgeable alongside your character, both in terms of what to expect from the world around you, as well as through the increasing number of gameplay options that are available to you. It simply doesn't need to abstract the idea of gaining experience to a bar that fills up, because gaining experience is exactly the thing that the player does the entire time themselves. While the game isn't strictly a first-person shooter, it does have a standout signature weapon in the glue cannon, which shoots out expanding foam and is used in various ways throughout the game. For example, it lets you patch up hull breaches, put out fires, patch up fuse boxes that discharge electrical arcs across the place, create bridges across electrified floors, and it can be used to create makeshift stairs and ramps in order to reach high places. That last bit can be a bit tricky though, because first-person platforming in Prey is as painful and teeth-grindingly maddening as it ever was. Since you can't build up glue on top of itself, you'll have to rely on some very wonky collision detection, and be prepared for your character to not grab onto the glue if you intend to climb on top of it in about 50% of the attempts. Another critical use of the glue cannon is against the enemies you'll encounter throughout Talos 1. Since Prey still wants to be a horror game, it's advisable to not simply waltz in guns blazing, at least at first, because that will most likely get you killed. Strategic hit-and-run tactics yield far greater results, but I have to say the rigmarole of covering at least all the common alien enemies in foam to incapacitate them and then take them out with a pistol or a shotgun got tiring fairly quickly. That is at least until you unlock some of the Psi abilities that offer supplementary ways of dealing with the aliens called Typhon, but that can be quite a ways into the game. I personally found that using Psycho Shock to disable the Typhon's Psi abilities as well as dealing some damage worked wonders when followed up with a couple of shotgun blasts, even for the odd telepath or technopath you may encounter, since they're basically defenseless without their Psi abilities. And if you upgrade that ability and manage to find the corresponding chipset that lowers cooldown times on Psi abilities, which is one of the very few chipsets I undoubtedly found useful, you can basically one or two shot most enemies without much trouble, because the cooldown of Psycho Shock takes less time than the stun effect lasts on your enemies. In my experience, even the Gargantuan Nightmare can easily be cheesed with relatively little effort. During my playthrough, the first one I crossed paths with was quite intimidating when I encountered it in the lobby after fixing the elevator. I tried to engage with it and see if I could damage it, but after that attempt failed miserably, to say the least, I simply opted to stay inside the elevator and run out the clock, since nightmares only last for a few minutes before they disappear. Nightmares have a tendency of spawning whenever you unlock a couple of Typhon abilities, so the second one spawned while I was in the crew quarters doing exactly that, which proved to be quite an advantageous battlefield for me, since nightmares can force themselves through human-sized doorways. I just pelted it with all I got and managed to take the bastard down, which was worthwhile if you intend to harvest lots of exotic materials for crafting. The third one spawned once again in the crew quarters, whose architectural features I again managed to make use of. And since I figured out the effectiveness of the Psycho Shock ability by that point to disable its homing attacks and making liberal use of the Q-beam, it was fairly easy to make short work of that and any future nightmares. Classically, many immersive sims also offer a more evasive style of gameplay that doesn't lead to direct confrontation with the enemies. And it was with quite some astonishment that I came to realize that stealth in Prey is severely underwhelming. I know I said earlier that I dislike making too many comparisons to Dishonored, but for a company that made some of the most accessible and enjoyable stealth games of the modern gaming era, it's interesting how Arcane opted not to feature stealth more prominently in Prey. There are only very few ways you can stealthily interact with the game world. For one, because you simply lack a lot of gameplay interactions that people familiar with Dishonored or games like the modern Deus Ex titles would have found useful. Second, the level design doesn't seem conducive to offer both an aggressive and stealthy way of traversing it. Oftentimes there are no paths that lead past enemies at all, you simply have to stop and engage them directly or try your best to use simplistic sneaking behind furniture to get by. This is especially true at the beginning when you're the most vulnerable. You don't get access to any of the alien powers for quite a while. In my case it was around 4 hours into the game, and since Prey also wants to be a horror game and ammo is fairly scarce before you're able to liberally craft it yourself, a more stealthy option would have been very welcome, instead of having to suffer a bunch of trial and error deaths. In the end, once I figured out that stealth was basically pointless since you need to engage with enemies in order to gather up all the resources you need, I basically abandoned that notion for the most part. That is, right up until the very final stretch of the game. Given that Prey has you running back and forth between sections of the ship multiple times, the sections of the ship don't continuously stay the same over the course of the game. For one, enemies constantly respawn to give you something to do, but the game also introduces more and more enemy types to previous sections to keep things interesting. At a certain point towards the end, the game kicks into high gear and introduces a large number of extremely tough and annoying to deal with floating robot enemies called military operators, which are a stronger variant of the regular operators you encounter all over the station, which can be both friend and foe. But the military operators are so numerous and annoying to fight that I spent a large amount of resources just to deal with them and the damage they can dish out. At some point I was low on ammo and health items, and I also didn't have a lot of crafting resources left to create either of the two, so I simply tried to outrun all the enemies on the way to my destination because I got overwhelmed by all these military operators. Unlike the Typhon, which don't respawn in large numbers while you're in an area, only when you return from somewhere else, the military operators tend to respawn the second you kill one of them from a nearby dispenser. And since I couldn't explore the shuttle bay section of Talos 1 before the main quest had me visited, I never got to go through that part of the station as thoroughly as I liked. I also feel that the presence of the military operators constitutes somewhat of a plot hole. All over the station you can find dispensers that produce a variety of operators. Each of the friendly ones are useful to use since they're able to either heal you, fix your suit, or fill up your pool of psi points, which is basically your mana bar. They help you conserve items that would serve the same purpose because they do it for free. But you can only ever create a maximum of 3 operators in each of those dispensers. And yet somehow, during the penultimate chapter of the game, these dispensers flood the entire station with military operators who are capable of easily taking out the Typhon themselves, and they continuously respawn within seconds of a previous one getting destroyed. If that possibility existed, why isn't there a safety protocol in place to just do that in case of an outbreak, way before the Typhon could overrun the entire station like they did? To be honest, by that point I was already anticipating the ending of the game, and I just felt that the detour the plot takes at that point seemed like needless busywork. To be fair, that point came in at around 20 hours of gameplay, but it felt like just enough of a random additional thing to deal with that the pacing suffered because of it. I would have preferred it if the game omitted that part entirely and just got to the point it was naturally building up to. There are only so many times you can have a simple sounding goal, in Prey's case it's blowing up the Talos 1, and have the player travel to Mount Doom and back just to continue with the main objective, and unfortunately Prey overstretched my tolerance for that somewhat. Now, at this point I have to delve into spoiler territory for the game in order to discuss the next bit, so be warned that I will be talking about all the spoilers in this game now, so if you want to avoid those, here's my conclusive statement about Prey. It's an extremely absorbing and intelligent game, and all the stuff I'm going to be talking about in the spoiler section is utterly unique in ways I haven't seen before. Yes, the gameplay of Prey might be a little clunky and the animation quality might be fairly underwhelming, but the philosophy behind it and the sheer balls it takes to tell a tale like this, especially in a game that can last for hours without significant plot happening, is staggering. Also, the music and sound design are absolutely sublime, which are only slightly marred by some weird issues where sound seems to cut out abruptly if you increase the distance to the source of the sound. And do I really have to comment on the art direction by this point? The Art Deco style is gorgeous and all the respective zones have styles befitting their purpose. The living spaces exude a sense of luxury and the laboratories and engineering sections look more utilitarian, so the levels are first and foremost designed as places where people would live and work, not as planned obstacle courses for the players. There's only one final gripe I can formulate here before I delve into spoiler territory, and this one is petty even for me. The Talos 1 orbits the moon, and when you look out the windows or venture outside you can see the moon floating in outer space. However, you can also see planet Earth as well, and there's a slight problem with this. It's the fact that Earth's angular size as depicted in the game is gigantic. In reality, the Earth's radius is around 4 times bigger than the moon's, so that's how much larger it would look like if observed from the moon's surface, not this massive planet that would suggest that we're barely half an hour's drive away from Earth. So with that out of the way, let's spoil this son of a bitch. I have to backtrack a little here and give you an overview of the setup. Your character is Morgan Yu, Doctor of Science, as a handy doctorate in your office points out. Morgan and his brother Alex aren't just random crew members on the Talos 1. Alex is the CEO of TranStar, the company that bought the space station, expanded it, and continues the study of the Typhon in order to produce neuromods that replicate their abilities. Your parents sit on the board of the directors of TranStar, and when they learn of the Typhon outbreak on the station, they send a character up to the Talos 1 in order to secure all the tech and wipe out all the survivors, including you. That's the final detour I was talking about, where I felt that the game just inserted another random obstacle in your way just to give you a reason to actually visit the shuttle bay. You get a choice of either killing him or merely incapacitating him. If you choose the latter, you get the option of removing his neuromods, thus resetting his memories and making him forget his assignment. It also means that since he came to the station with his own ship, the other people you encounter and may end up helping have a way of leaving the station safely if you decide to blow it up in the end. However, the station still has a bunch of escape pods that could be used for the same purpose, so it's not like you'd really need this guy and his ship to get the other survivors and yourself off the station. I mean, if the option to get rid of the station existed the entire time and people on Earth were aware of the outbreak, why not actually do that instead of tasking the player to do it? But the idea of saving other characters on this station is also the crux of the matter because it tests your empathy, and there's a reason for that. The game opens up with a psychological evaluation. Normally this is just fluff to set the scenes, something irrelevant that gives the player a sense of normality before shit hits the fan and the game proper begins. Prey, however, uses this psychological evaluation in interesting ways. Not because it uses the answers later on for or against you, but if you're alert enough to notice what's going on, you'll end up judging yourself and the choices you've made in the beginning, and that's something very few games have managed to do until now, especially this elegantly. The game opens up in what you later learn to be a simulation. You as Morgan Yu seem to be running through these tests numerous times and seemingly only do those tests, which are all designed to test if you're still able to use Typhon powers even after removing your neuromods and resetting your memories. However, as you learn at the very end, the entire game was a simulation as well. This might seem like a cheap cop-out at first, because there are a number of bad stories that end with "it was all just a dream", so it's easy to think that Prey also falls victim to that. However, the game makes it clear at the very end that the point of it all is that you've helped the characters you've encountered over the course of the simulation and showed empathy towards them. The characters from the simulation are actually present at the end of the game, represented as operators and not real people. They recount your actions, and if you've helped them, it gives an indicator towards your ability to feel and display empathy. And the reason for that is because you don't actually play as Morgan Yu, Doctor of Science. You're actually a Typhon human hybrid who experienced the simulation based on the memories of Morgan Yu as an attempt of reversing the roles. That's why the game opens up with a simulation inside the simulation. It uses the supposed shift from the normality of the opening simulation to trick you into believing that you're a human being on Talos 1 in order to test if you can feel empathy for the crew and their dire situation. See, humans put parts of the Typhon into themselves in order to gain their abilities through neuromods, and at some point the outbreak on the Talos 1 really did happen. Only the real crew on board didn't manage to contain it, and Earth got overrun by the Typhon organisms. The entire main plotline of the game is irrelevant because regardless of your actions, nothing changes in the end. The only purpose of the game is to see if the player helps other people on the station through numerous side quests. That's why you're being judged based on if you've showed empathy for their needs and requests or not, because most of the side quests offer no tangible reward whatsoever for completing them. It's explained over the course of the game that the Typhon aren't inherently evil. They just lack any awareness that when they kill, they're doing something we would consider wrong. They merely act on instinct in pursuing a food source, which apparently is consciousness itself. So the idea is to force a Typhon to at first be posed a number of questions where you have to simply answer them without any consequences. And then it lets you loose on the station to figure out if you would answer these questions the same way if they were not mere hypotheticals. One of the questions posed is the classic trolley problem. In case you haven't heard of it before, it's an ethical dilemma posed the following way. A runaway trolley is speeding down some railway tracks. On the tracks there's a group of 5 people who can't move out of the way for one reason or another. You're standing between them and the trolley at a lever that will cause the trolley to switch to a pair of adjacent railway tracks, thus sparing the group. However, there's another person on that second set of tracks. The questions that arise from here are the following. What is the more ethical option? Do the
needs of the many outweigh
the needs of the few?
Why? Would you merely weigh up the fact that 5 lives are more important than 1? Is the act of actively condemning another person to death who would have been fine without your interference justifiable under those considerations? Or is the act of not helping others in need even though less people come to harm with your help just as bad as actively causing harm to a single person? Can you weigh up 1 life to a number of others and break down this dilemma to a raw calculation? If a human life in and of itself is invaluable, you can't really reasonably say that more lives have more value, right? The game doesn't judge you, regardless of how you answer these questions, but it makes you live through this dilemma yourself. Over the course of the game, Prey shows you that neuromods are created through a horrific process that requires humans to die. There's an entire quest about retrieving information about one character's father who got sent up to the station because he got sentenced to death on Earth for disagreeing with his government and got offered the chance of being a test subject for TranStar in exchange for seeing his daughter again. Instead, he gets used in a pointless experiment and dies a gruesome death. And what's worse is that Morgan, the character you think you're inhabiting at this point in the game, gives the order to run the experiment. I mean, what's a few convicts' lives when you could better the entirety of humanity through neuromods? It also poses an interesting contrast because here you have the Typhon, aliens who are very explicitly presented as definitely lacking any and all ability to experience empathy. And then you have a group of scientists who willingly sacrifice a person for the benefit of mankind while that person is talking to them, begging for his life. They actively have to suppress their empathy in order to run that experiment. It directly shows to the player what happens when you apply the principle of the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few if you're not the person actually making the sacrifice yourself. But the game doesn't stop at that. It gives you a choice of either deleting said information or presenting it to his daughter, which means directly incriminating yourself right in front of her, even though you personally don't remember giving the order since you still believe that you're suffering from amnesia. You have to put yourself into an extraordinarily uncomfortable position to potentially suffer the dire consequences of actions you don't remember committing, and depending on what kind of player you are, would have never committed in the first place if you actually were in Morgan's shoes at that time, only to give emotional closure to another person. But this is also addressed by the choice you can make regarding the Talos 1. Do you blow up the space station, potentially killing people who are still on here to definitely put an end to the Typhon menace and save the faceless billions of planet Earth? Or do you merely disable the Typhon and save the research done on Talos 1 and maintain the threat of another outbreak just to save the few people you managed to encounter on the space station? The game also asks further variations of the trolley problems at the start, basically asking you if you would be willing to sacrifice yourself for others. This is represented by a series of quests for other characters that don't actually net you any reward at all. While I was playing the game, I somehow felt like these quests seemed extremely pointless, just busy work because, hey, we need some side quests for the player to do, right? But right at the end, it recounts all those superficially meaningless things you did for other characters, simply because they had meaning for them, and not for you. You showed empathy for people you didn't even know, because the game made sure to give Morgan amnesia and the Typhon you're playing as and you as the player obviously have no connection to these people. I remember the quest that tasks you to find a Neuromod recording of a famous pianist. Not because it was valuable or practical, but because it's a memento to the character who gives you said quest. I felt that this quest was entirely pointless to go through with, but I still did it because what's the point of merely surviving this ordeal but losing everything that's dear to us in the process? Another character tasks you with killing one of the convicts posing as a chef because he murdered that character's girlfriend. This is to test your sense of retribution for transgressions against human lives, something the Typhon are incapable of grasping as wrong. But it's also reflected in the ending you choose. One ending lets you escape Talos 1 very early on, and it basically clues you in that the entire thing is a simulation way before the real endings flat out state that fact. I personally felt that this entire questline was kinda stupid and superfluous at the time, because it's not a true conclusion to the game since it puts you right back into it just before you make that choice, and it spoils one of the twists at the end of the game. Though in retrospect, I don't think that it was all a simulation ending was supposed to be that much of a twist anyway. The game frequently gives you hints toward that being the case, from those few flashes of the real world you get to see at certain points in the game to entire monologues of other characters telling you how you've changed or asking you who you really are. Escaping Talos 1 early gives you the same dialogue from Alex and the operators that you'd get if you behaved without empathy for the rest of the game and reached the actual ending, basically telling you that the simulation was a failure to prove that the Typhon human test subject you're inhabiting had any empathy to begin with. Leaving early to save your own hide and not bothering to deal with either the Typhon or the problems of the remaining survivors of Talos 1 requires a total lack of empathy on your part. And I do have to say I feel ashamed of having gone through with this ending, especially as early as I did, since I managed to use the glue cannon to get up to the escape pod way earlier than I'd usually be allowed to through other means. As you can see, Prey goes to great lengths to explore these philosophical and ethical dilemmas, and I applaud it for being so bold. There aren't many games that give you the option of looking inward and seeing the horror that lurks within you. Prey may superficially be a horror game about being trapped in outer space with scary hostile aliens who camouflage themselves as regular objects. But the real horror is confronting the potential lack of empathy humans can display towards each other. Scientists killing sometimes innocent convicts for scientific progress, ignoring the needs of the few for the needs of the many. That's where Prey's real horror comes from, to confront the darkness that lurks behind the tissue-thin veneer of humanity and civilization. That's why the final question posed at the very end, the one that asks you to take Alex's hand or kill him and all the operators in the room, is not as hackneyed as it might appear on the surface level. It purposefully switches the roles around and asks you, the player, if you believe humanity is able to redeem itself in the face of the atrocities we commit to each other and to every other living being. If you take Alex's hand, you have hope for humanity. If you kill him, you condemn humanity. So what's your choice going to be?